It is the story of Ethan Miller, a man who once fought a war overseas but found his hardest battles waiting for him at home. Ethan never thought that silence could feel this heavy. He sat outside a gray building one cloudy morning, the smell of rain mixing with the city dust, and the world seemed to move around him as if he didn't exist. Inside, a woman with polite eyes and a rehearsed smile had just said what too many others already had. "I'm sorry, Mr. Miller, you're just not the right fit." Her voice was kind, but the words were cold. Rejection doesn't hurt less when it's gentle, it just cuts slower. Ethan didn't argue, he didn't even look back. He walked out, the sound of his uneven footsteps echoing behind him. The war had taken a lot from him, 3 fingers on his left hand, a smooth walk, and most of his sleep. But what hurt more than the scars was how quickly his country had forgotten him. He sat down on a bench outside, lit a cigarette, and watched the smoke disappear into the gray sky. For the world, the war was over, but for Ethan, it had never truly ended. When he came back home from Afghanistan, he thought things would be different. He imagined warmth, maybe love, maybe pride. Instead, he walked into a home that no longer felt like home. His mother, Martha, opened the door, her hair messy, her eyes red from years of drinking. For a brief moment, she looked like the mother he remembered until she smiled weakly and said, "Ethan, you're home." Behind her, laughter and clinking bottles filled the small apartment. Strangers sat at their kitchen table drinking, barely noticing him. His mother tried to wave them off, mumbling something about her son being back from the army. Ethan wanted to be angry, but instead he just felt tired. He hugged her quietly and said, "It's okay, Mom," even though nothing about it was. That night, he sat on the balcony, looking out at the city lights. He had survived the battlefield, but he couldn't survive the loneliness of peace. He told himself things would get better because there was still one person he thought he could count on: Emily Parker, the woman he had loved before the war. Emily had written him letters at first, pages full of love and hope, but near the end of his deployment, her letters grew shorter, colder, distant. Still, he believed in her. He believed in the promise of home. The night he returned, he went straight to her house. He didn't call first, he wanted to surprise her. When she opened the door, her eyes widened, not with joy but with something else. Guilt, maybe. She smiled faintly and invited him inside. They talked. She poured him tea. She asked about the war, but her voice trembled in that way people's voices do when they're hiding something. And then there was a knock on the door. "That must be my mom," she said quickly and walked out, but Ethan heard a man's voice in the hallway, a voice he knew too well. He stood and followed the sound, and when he looked around the corner, he froze. It was Michael, his best friend, his brother from the army, the man who had once pulled him out of an explosion and saved his life. And now that same man was standing in his place, holding the hand of the woman Ethan loved. He heard Michael whisper, "I'll tell him it's over, he deserves that." Ethan didn't move, didn't speak, didn't scream. He just stood there, broken in a way no bullet had ever managed to break him. Then he turned toward the door and said softly, "I thought nothing was stronger than brotherhood. I guess I was wrong." And with that, he walked away, not in anger but in silence. Days passed, then weeks. He searched for work anywhere he could: construction, factories, deliveries, but nobody wanted him. Some said his injuries made him unfit. Others were honest and said they didn't trust men who had been to war. "Too many come back unstable," one manager told him. After that, Ethan stopped trying to explain himself. One cold morning, he found work at a small local market owned by an old trader named Gregory Thompson. Gregory was a man who believed in hard work and second chances. He didn't care about the past, only what you could do today. Ethan also met Gregory's daughter, Clara. She was quiet and kind, the sort of person who saw things no one else did. He remembered her from school, the shy girl who sat in the back and kept to herself. One evening, as they were closing the shop, Clara noticed him struggling to tie a box with his half hand. She walked over, smiled gently, and said, "Can I help?" When her fingers touched his scarred hand, she didn't flinch. She just tied the knot, looked at him, and said softly, "It doesn't make you broken, it makes you real." For a long time after that, those words echoed in his mind. For the first time in years, someone had looked at him without pity, and that changed everything. Over the next few months, Ethan worked harder than ever. Gregory noticed, and one night over dinner he said, "You've got potential, son. You ever think about business?" Ethan laughed. "Business? I barely survived the army." Gregory smiled. "Then it's time you learn something new." He offered Ethan a chance to join him and his son Tom on a long drive to buy used cars for resale. Ethan hesitated at first, but deep down he wanted to say yes. Maybe a change of scenery was what he needed. That trip turned out to be more than a business venture. It was a reminder that life could still be simple and good. They spent long days on the road, trading jokes, sharing stories, staying in small motels with squeaky beds and broken lamps. Gregory treated him like family. For the first time since the war, Ethan laughed without forcing it. When they returned home, Clara ran out of the house and hugged her father, then Ethan. "I'm just glad you're back," she said, tears in her eyes. That night, Gregory raised his glass at dinner and said, "To second chances." Ethan smiled, maybe he finally had one. Months passed and Ethan and Clara grew closer. Their love wasn't dramatic, it was quiet, honest, built on understanding rather than words. One night he told her, "You make the world feel safe again." And she smiled, the kind of smile that said she'd been waiting her whole life to hear that. They got married not long after, a simple ceremony in Gregory's backyard. No fancy decorations, no crowd, just two people who knew what it meant to lose everything and still choose love. When he brought Clara to meet his mother, Martha cried. She had stopped drinking, started working again, and finally looked like the mother he remembered. She hugged him and whispered, "I'm proud of you, son." For a while, everything was perfect, but peace has a way of leaving without warning. One day, Gregory planned another trip and Clara begged Ethan not to go. "Please," she said softly, "let them handle it this time." He kissed her forehead and said, "Everything will be fine." But deep down he wasn't sure. The trip began smoothly, long roads, laughter, the kind of tired comfort that comes from good company. But on the way home, everything changed. A black SUV began following them. No plates, no reason. Gregory slowed down. The SUV slowed too. When he stopped, it stopped. Four men stepped out, hard faces, cold eyes. "They want money," Gregory muttered. Ethan clenched his fists. "We've paid enough in this life." He stepped forward, ready to defend them. Then one of the men shouted, "Bring out Chris." Ethan froze. That name, it couldn't be. And then from the shadows, a man stepped out. He was older, thinner, scarred, but unmistakable. "Chris," Ethan whispered. The man smiled, a shocked, emotional smile. "Ethan Miller, you've got to be kidding me." Ethan could barely breathe. "I thought you were dead." Chris laughed and hugged him hard. "I thought you were too." Then he turned to the others and said, "These guys are with me, let them go." The tension vanished instantly. Later that night, they sat in Chris's small house, drinking and talking. Chris told him what had happened, how he'd survived the explosion, how he'd been captured, and how he came home to nothing. "When you've got nowhere to go," Chris said, "even the wrong place starts to feel like home." Ethan nodded. He told Chris everything about Emily, Michael, the loneliness, and how he'd finally found peace. Chris listened, then asked, "You ever see Mike again?" Ethan sighed. "He's gone, bad choices caught up with him." Chris nodded slowly. "Then stop fighting ghosts, brother. You survived the war, now survive yourself." The next morning, Ethan went home. Clara ran out and hugged him tightly, tears in her eyes. "It's over," he whispered, "all of it." A few days later, Chris came to see him. He wanted to start over. Together with Gregory, they opened a small auto repair shop. They fixed cars, shared laughter, and piece by piece rebuilt their lives. Years passed. Ethan and Clara had a son, a bright, happy boy with her smile and his quiet eyes. One summer evening, Ethan sat on the porch with Clara beside him. Their little boy chased fireflies in the yard, his laughter filling the warm air. Clara looked at him and asked softly, "Do you ever think about them, the ones who didn't come back?" Ethan smiled faintly. "Every day," he said, "but I also think about the ones who did, the ones who still have a chance." He turned to her and said gently, "For the first time, I'm not running from the past, I'm living for the future." She smiled and rested her head on his shoulder. The night was calm, and the world finally felt quiet, not the empty kind of quiet, but the peaceful kind that comes when you've finally forgiven the world for all it took from you. Ethan Miller, the soldier who once came home to nothing, had found everything he had ever been fighting for. Because sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought on the battlefield, they're fought in the heart. And sometimes the greatest victory of all is learning how to live again.